the architects of unimaginable horrors, the enforcers of a twisted ideology, the black-clad figures haunting a landscape scarred by death. The SS, in the annals of the era's depravity, stand as paragons of calculated malice. Yet, even within that meticulously constructed hierarchy of inhumanity, whispers circulated of a unit whose actions were so extreme, so flagrant in their disregard for any semblance of decency, that they provoked protest even from those steeped in the very darkness they represented. This is the chronicle of that unit, a chilling testament to the depths humanity can plumb, a narrative so disturbing it serves as a stark reminder. The abyss is always deeper than we imagine. Before we proceed, understand that this account contains descriptions of extreme violence and actions that defy comprehension. Discretion is paramount. To comprehend the monstrosity that was this unit, we must first understand the man who lent it his name, a figure both chillingly complex and utterly abhorrent. Born into the aftermath of global conflict, this individual, whom we shall refer to as D, bore the scars of the trenches, both visible and unseen. Decorated for valour, a recipient of accolades for bravery amidst the carnage, he nevertheless remained tethered to the violence that had shaped him. The chaos of the post-war era, the rise of paramilitary factions engaging in brutal street brawls became his domain. Violence was not merely an occupation, but a language he spoke fluently. And here a disturbing paradox emerges. D was not some unlettered brute. He possessed an education, a doctorate in social studies, a veneer of respectability masking an insatiable appetite for brutality, and something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface. Throughout those turbulent decades, he was repeatedly entangled in legal troubles, facing charges related to financial impropriety and the unlawful possession of implements of war. Then the mask slipped entirely. Accusations of misconduct against a minor surfaced, leading to a conviction, a prison sentence, the revocation of his academic achievements, and the stripping of his military honours. Stripped bare, a pariah, his story, by any reasonable measure, should have concluded there, a footnote in the records of local law enforcement. But he existed within a framework devoid of reason, where moral boundaries were not merely blurred, but actively erased. The question arises, what manner of organisation would not only disregard a man's past transgressions, but see them as qualifications? The answer lies within the very nature of the system itself. D maintained a connection with someone he knew from his violent past, now a high-ranking official deeply entwined within the inner circle of the organisation's leadership. Through this connection, D not only avoided the consequences of his actions, but was welcomed into the fold. The system did not merely forgive him, it embraced him, recognising that to construct their envisioned reality they required individuals unburdened by outdated notions of morality, law, or human compassion. They needed individuals already shattered, already predisposed to the darkness they sought to unleash. Under the protection of his associate, D was not merely rehabilitated, he was entrusted with a project, an idea so bizarre it could only have germinated within the twisted logic of the regime. The proposal, the creation of a specialised group comprised of those convicted of transgressions against hunting laws. The rationale, as cynical as it was perverse, hinged on their skills in tracking, marksmanship and survival within forested environments. Who better, then, to pursue those resisting in the dense woodlands of occupied lands? The idea was approved, and the group was formally established. A group of hunters, tasked with the hunting of people. Deployed to areas under control, their initial reports were not of successful military operations, but of widespread insubordination, theft, drunken behaviour, and the indiscriminate taking of civilian lives. Most disturbingly, accusations of sexual violence surfaced. The group was spiralling out of control. Any conventional military force would have disbanded it, court-martialing its leader. But this was not a conventional force, and within the cold calculus of occupation, The chaos and terror they generated were not viewed as a liability, but as an asset. The experiment, it was decided, was a success and poised for expansion. The expansion of the experiment coincided with the widening scope of conflict. As the struggle against opposing forces intensified, the fight against those resisting became a brutal shadow war, consuming all in its path. This provided the perfect environment for a unit like D's to flourish. It was transferred to a region characterized by deep forests, vast swamplands, and a population vehemently opposed to the occupation. Here, the unit would discover its true purpose. The selection criteria were broadened, extending beyond those who had violated hunting laws. Permission was granted to recruit directly from the shadows, prisons and later even camps where people were held against their will. It is crucial to be explicit about who was being recruited. These were not people imprisoned for expressing dissenting beliefs. They were the dregs of society, individuals convicted of heinous crimes. Murderers, robbers, arsonists, and those with a history of violence were given a uniform and a weapon. The logic was simple. To combat those resisting considered less than human, one needed soldiers who were equally dehumanized. D's group became a magnet for the worst elements of society, a penal unit where the only path to redemption lay in committing atrocities, and commit them they did, with an enthusiasm that horrified even those accustomed to the horrors of war. Here, in the blood-soaked earth, they perfected what became known as the D method. Horrifyingly simple and repeatable template for destruction. Their objective was not to engage those resisting in combat, but to eradicate the very notion of resistance by eliminating the civilian population that sustained it. The procedure was consistently the same. The unit would surround a settlement suspected of harbouring those who resisted. Then they would systematically gather every living being, the elderly, the young, men, women, children. No one was spared. The entire population would be forced into a single structure, typically a large wooden barn or the local place of worship. The entrances would be sealed, and the structure would be set ablaze. Machine emplacements would be set up to target anyone who managed to escape the inferno. This was not an isolated incident of rage. It was standard protocol. Historical records estimate that in this region alone, D's group destroyed countless settlements in this manner, responsible for the lives of countless civilians. Let that number resonate. Countless. A single unit, responsible for a death toll exceeding that of many major engagements. When a soldier's primary metric of success is the number of civilians they can eliminate, can it even be classified as a military force anymore? Has it transformed into something else entirely, something beyond definition? Their cruelty was boundless. They devised a method for clearing areas filled with explosives. Instead of employing trained personnel or specialized equipment, they would simply gather civilians from nearby settlements, forcing them to walk across the area. Their bodies would absorb the blasts, clearing a path for the soldiers who followed. This was not a last-ditch measure taken in the heat of combat. It was a calculated act of depravity, repeated time and again. They were not simply killing. They were reveling in the act of dehumanization itself. For an extended period, they transformed the forests and settlements into their personal killing grounds. The unit grew, expanding to the size of a brigade. Their reputation for terror became their most potent weapon. But as horrific as their actions were, they were in retrospect merely a prelude, a training ground. They were refining their skills, becoming masters of mass murder. And in the summer of a year that would be remembered for its agony, they would be summoned to perform on the grandest, most terrible stage imaginable. Their destination, a major city, a centre of culture, teeming with countless civilians. They were being deployed to a city in revolt. As forces from the east approached, the local resistance launched an uprising, a desperate gamble to liberate their capital before external assistance arrived. In the initial days, the resistance achieved remarkable success, seizing control of significant portions of the city and catching the occupying forces completely off guard. For the leadership, This was an intolerable act of defiance. The response was not to be a military operation. It was to be an act of obliteration. The order issued to the commanders was chillingly direct, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Every inhabitant was to be eliminated. No prisoners were to be taken. The city was to be razed to the ground, serving as a terrifying example to the rest of the region. To execute such an order, one did not send soldiers, one sent butchers. And so, the specialists in terror were summoned. D's group was ordered to the city alongside another infamous unit comprised of collaborators. They were the arsonists called in not to extinguish the flames, but to become the fire itself. What ensued was one of the most extreme acts of mass violence of the conflict. Upon arrival, the group did not engage the resistance forces. Instead, they carried out the order to the letter. They unleashed a methodical wave of murder that defied comprehension. Moving from street to street, house to house, they dragged out every civilian they could find, executing them in courtyards and public spaces. They stormed hospitals, slaying medical personnel as they tended to the injured and eliminating patients in their beds. They massacred religious figures in places of worship and launched explosives into spaces filled with women and children seeking shelter. There was no logic to their actions. Age, gender, innocence. None of these were relevant. They were simply an extermination squad moving through a civilian population. Their actions were so extreme, so utterly depraved, that they provoked condemnation from regular military units also engaged in the fighting. It was noted that the group's actions bore little resemblance to soldierly conduct. Consider that, an organisation that was itself complicit in countless crimes, and they were appalled. The ultimate condemnation came from the man in overall command of the forces in the city, a figure who had spent years orchestrating the executions of many in the region. This was a seasoned killer. Yet, witnessing D's men at work, he described them as nothing more than animals. He complained that they were unreliable, consumed by intoxicants, and more interested in looting and sexual violence than combat. When the man responsible for crushing the uprising, a hardened individual in his own right, is horrified by your methods, you have descended to a level of depravity that defies description. In a single area, in a short period, countless civilians were taken by D's and the collaborating groups. It remains one of the most intense acts of slaughter against a civilian population in modern history. After their work was completed in one area, they moved on to others, continuing their campaign of murder and destruction, leaving a trail of absolute devastation. They had reached the apex of their malevolence, but for monsters like these, there is always a price to be paid, and with the conflict turning against the forces on all fronts, the reckoning was at hand. As the uprising was brutally suppressed, the war tightened its grip. External forces were relentlessly advancing. In this new reality of total war, even a specialised penal unit like D's group could no longer be kept in reserve for extermination duties. They were needed on the front lines. Officially designated as a division, they were thrust into combat against trained soldiers. The outcome was predictable. The skills they had honed, terrorising unarmed individuals, were utterly useless against armoured vehicles, artillery and disciplined infantry. The group, so effective as an instrument of killing, proved to be an almost completely ineffective military unit. Comprised of undisciplined criminals, they lacked the cohesion, training and courage to withstand the onslaught. In the desperate battles, they were systematically decimated. They suffered catastrophic losses, and the unit effectively disintegrated. The hunters had finally encountered a force more powerful than themselves. And what of the man who lent this unit its name, D? He did not perish alongside his men. Wounded, he was sent to the rear to recover. Exploiting his connections, he slipped away, abandoning the remnants of his group to their fate. After the war had ended, he was apprehended by forces. He was disguised, attempting to blend in with the displaced people. He was identified and handed over to the local authorities. And here, the story takes its final turn. The circumstances surrounding D's demise have been obscured by time, but the most widely accepted account is this. The camp where he was held was guarded by soldiers who knew what D had done. They were not interested in waiting for a trial. Over time, he was reportedly taken from his cell and beaten. He perished in that camp, a victim of the same violence he had championed his entire life. It was not justice, it was revenge. The fate of his men was equally ignominious. The vast majority were taken in the final battles of the war. Of those who survived and were captured, some were tried and punished for their crimes, but many simply disappeared. Their crimes were so chaotic, their records so poorly maintained, that they were able to vanish back into society. Their hands stained with the blood of countless lives, they evaded justice. So, what is the lasting effect of this story? It is essential to understand that this was not a good unit that went astray. It was a state-sanctioned instrument of pure terror from its inception. It reminds us that the regime was not merely a political entity. It was a system that actively sought out the most depraved elements of humanity and weaponized them. They did not simply tolerate individuals like D, they found them, empowered them, and unleashed them. The story of this unit serves as a warning. It proves that the bottom is always lower than we imagine. It is a chilling testament to what can happen when a philosophy declares that certain